Hello friends, neighbors, and fellow VEDSies. It is day 26 of VEDS, I think, if I get this video up on the day that I think I'm going to get it up, and I think that it's high time that we brought back the Ultimate Recommendation Book Club. Don't you? Well, I do, and it's my channel, so we're gonna do it. So far in this series, I have reviewed 4 books: The Book Thief by Marcus Zusak, There's a Boy in the Girl's Bathroom by Louis Sachar, Looking for Alaska by John Green, and To Kill a Mockingbird by Harper Lee. And the 5th book in the Ultimate Recommendation Book Club, appropriately enough, is The 5 People You Meet in Heaven by Mitch Albom. Albom? Now, when I first said I was going to be doing this particular book for the Ultimate Recommendation Book Club, I said it with a caveat, which is that it's not nearly as religious as it sounds. And it's a caveat that I feel like I kind of have to give for this book because it sounds not just like a religious book, but it sounds like one of those books where the person, goes into a coma or their heart stops and they technically die for 90 minutes or whatever, but then they're resuscitated and they wake up talking about how they spent this time in heaven and walking with Jesus and talking with the saints and all that sort of thing. And it's always presented as a thing that actually happened, like a real-life memoir and basically proof that heaven exists and God and Jesus and everything in the Bible is actually true. And I don't like those books, really at all. I didn't even like them when I was a regular churchgoer, and I certainly don't like them now. And so I always want to give that caveat that this book is not that book. This is a work of fiction, and it is presented from the get-go as a work of fiction. And I was kind of interested to see how I was going to approach this reread, because the last time I read this book, I was still a regular churchgoer. I actually worked at a church as a worship leader, and I considered myself to be a religious person. None of those things are really true anymore. And I came to the conclusion that I still don't think that this is a religious book. It doesn't subscribe to any one particular religion or denomination. Yes, it makes reference to heaven as a place where dead people go, and it makes reference to God a couple of times, but there's no specific religious affiliation that it's advocating for. It's not even really advocating for religion at all. It's basically just taking the idea of the afterlife and kind of putting a different spin on it in a way that kind of acts in the same way that a fantasy novel might, where it just kind of looks at real life through this fantastical lens and tries to find some truth through that. And while I don't think that this is a religious book necessarily, I do still think that it is a spiritual one. I do still think that the book acknowledges that there is something greater in the universe, that there is something bigger than what we can see in front of us that we can't possibly understand. But anyway, let's get into talking about the book itself. The book tells the story of a man named Eddie. We never know his last name, but we do learn quite a bit about his life, especially in the early, basically prologue portion of the book. The book gives us basically a snapshot of an ordinary day in Eddie's life. He is 83 years old. He actually turns 83 on the day that the story begins, and it also tells us from the beginning that the day that the story begins is also the day that Eddie dies. So the whole prologue is basically a countdown of the last minutes of Eddie's life, and it shows us a completely normal, ordinary day. And this is important because with Eddie being 83 years old, they could have had him dying of completely natural causes, but they wanted to show us a regular day, a regular, relatively healthy day in Eddie's life. And this early chapter gives us a lot of information on present day Eddie. We know that he works as a maintenance man, the head of maintenance at a seaside resort park called Ruby Pier. This is basically just a really small-time amusement park by the sea, the type that are usually kind of overshadowed by big places like Kings Island or Cedar Point or Disneyland. But a few of them still exist, and Eddie works at one of them as the head of maintenance. He doesn't necessarily like his job, he's not necessarily happy to be there, but his job is very important to him, and we kind of learn about this by hearing about other similar seaside amusement parks and a lot of the really horrific accidents that happen on a lot of these rides. Because we assume that safety standards are not necessarily as high at these smaller parks, we hear about a lot of accidents, but these accidents don't seem to affect Ruby Pier, and although it's not outright stated, it is strongly implied that this is largely because of the work that Eddie does as head of maintenance. He cares a lot about keeping the rides safe for the children who ride them. We also learn that Eddie has been at Ruby Pier for pretty much all his life. The only time that he left is when he went off to fight in a war. He says he never traveled anywhere that someone didn't send him with a gun. And so we can assume that he is also a war veteran, probably given his age and the time period where this story takes place, probably World War II. We also learn that Eddie cares a lot about children. He tolerates most adults, but he's not really a very social creature. He doesn't have a lot of close friends or any family living that we know of, and he doesn't like teenagers at all. He's very, very angry towards teenagers. He has an encounter with some of them in the early part of the book, although even in that encounter he is concerned for their safety. He just doesn't approach it as gently as he might have. But he does care a lot about the children who come to Ruby Pier. They know him, they know who he is, they call him Eddie Maintenance, they call him Eddie the Ride Man, and even though he is a curmudgeon and kind of irascible, they all really seem to like him, and they know how much he kind of cares about them and their safety. Also, Eddie takes to carrying pipe cleaners around in his pockets, and we see this with his encounter with the little girl, Annie or Amy. He doesn't even know her name, he just knows it's either Annie or Amy, but he knows that this is a child who is a regular, and he makes pipe cleaner animals for the children when they want them. And this sort of illustrates Eddie's ability to kind of take what he's given and do what he can with it. Obviously, for a park like this, maybe balloon animals would be the preferred thing, but he doesn't have balloon animals, he has pipe cleaners, so that's what he used, and that's what the children accept. We also do get an early indication of some of the things that happened in Eddie's life. We know that he has bad knees and probably suffered a knee injury at some point during his life. We know that he is, or at least he was, a fighter, like an actual physical fisticuffs fighter, and he got into some scrapes as a kid and as a young adult. And we know that his life has not always necessarily been a happy one. Again, he is pretty much alone at this stage in his life. It is indicated that he did have a woman in his life at some point, but she no longer seems to be in the picture for whatever reason. Eddie also believes himself to have lived a completely ordinary and meaningless life, and this is a theme that is going to continue to come back throughout this story. The fact that he believes that because he never really did what he wanted to do, he never left Ruby Pier like he wanted to, he never accomplished the things that he wanted to accomplish, because of all that, he has led a meaningless existence. But we see, even in this early chapter, some of the ways in which his life does have meaning for the people around him. Another running theme in this book is connectedness and the way that events lead to other events, and we see this in the manner in which Eddie dies. Basically, Eddie dies because a ride breaks. It's a ride that drops, raises you up and drops you all the way down, like one of the rides you see at a lot of these amusement parks. The ride breaks because a young teenager a few weeks prior lost his car key in the ride, and the key has been slowly shredding away at the safety belt or fan belt or something along those lines, and that has been slowly but surely breaking the machine. And Eddie realizes this too late, and when they release the ride to bring it back down to safety, the ride falls and it crushes Eddie as he is trying to save Annie or Amy, the little girl he gave the pipe cleaner animal to earlier, from getting crushed by the ride. So once again, he dies as he lived. He died trying to look after the safety of one of the children at his park. So Eddie dies and he goes off to heaven. Now, when we think of heaven, usually one or a combination of three different ideas of heaven come to mind. First, there's the idea of heaven as a paradise, the streets paved with gold and everybody happy and angels singing and all of that sort of thing. Second is heaven as a place up in the clouds where those who have died can look down on those of us who are still living, can see what we're doing, can see what we're up to, and can kind of watch over us. And third, of course, is heaven as a place of judgment, a place where our acts on earth are tabulated as good or bad, and it is ultimately decided whether whether we will spend eternity in heaven as good people or in hell as evil people, or depending on what you believe, in purgatory as kind of good, kind of evil people. But as this book reveals over time, none of these things are completely true, although they are all kind of true to a certain extent. For the purposes of this story, heaven exists in two stages. When you first die, you go to the afterlife and you visit with five people who died before you, who had some sort of a profound impact on your life, and who teach you some sort of lesson, helping you to sort out your existence on Earth. Once you have learned those 5 lessons, then you go to your own personal heaven, whatever that might be, and it's different for each person, and you wait until someone after you dies and comes to seek you out for you to teach them a lesson. You become one of the 5 people. So in this way, heaven is kind of a paradise and kind of a place where you find peace, but it's very much a place where you have to seek out your own paradise. It's not just handed to you. It's not just something that's presented as you die. You have to seek out your own paradise and your own peace by learning these lessons and making sense of the life that you lived. And it's not a place where you can look down on Earth and see what's going on. Eddie at no point is able to see what happened after he died. In fact, in each of the places that he visits, he asks the question, did I save the little girl? And he doesn't find out until the very end whether or not he did. But you do look after other people who have died, not necessarily the living, but the recently dead. There is a system in place where those who have been dead for longer can help the people who have just died to acclimate to heaven and to make sense of their lives. So in that way, you are kind of looking out for others. And as for it being a place of judgment, at no point are any of the acts that Eddie did on Earth considered good or evil. There is no judgment placed in that sense, but there is a judgment placed in the sense that of Eddie trying to make sense of the things that happened to him while he was alive. Not so he can go to heaven or go to hell, but just so he can find some peace of mind. Now, before I get into the individual 5 sections of this book, I do want to talk a little bit about the way that this book is structured, because Mitch Albom really does do a lot of structuring in his novels. So obviously the book is divided essentially into 5 sections, one for each of the 5 people that Eddie visits. Each of these sections is titled the first person in heaven, the second person Eddie meets in heaven, and so on, and each of them ends with a small section for the lesson, the first lesson, the second lesson, etc. But interspersed throughout all of these are occasional flashbacks or anecdotes from Eddie's life. Little passages, little scenes from when Eddie was still alive, and all of them take place on one of his birthdays, and they're all titled "Today is Eddie's Birthday." Sometimes something deeply meaningful happens on a birthday, and sometimes it's just kind of an ordinary day in his life. But each of these scenes reflect some of the things that he's learning about in the afterlife and some of the lessons that he's learning. And at the end of each section, we go back to the real world and we kind of look into the aftermath of Eddie's death, mostly surrounding basically his second in command, a guy named Dom, who is really the closest thing that Eddie has to a next of kin, and so is kind of going about the business of trying to set his affairs in order and basically trying to help everybody to move on after his death. And so in that way, we get kind of a many-faceted view of both Eddie's life and Eddie's death, and kind of the impact that his life really had, which again is a running theme throughout the entire story. We can see that Eddie had an impact during his life, but Eddie really isn't able to see that yet. So the first person who Eddie encounters is actually not a person who he knows well, like we would expect. So right away, they're kind of playing with our expectations here. And this actually factors into both the first lesson of the story and also a lesson that will kind of be a foundational theme of the book, that theme of connectedness that we saw in even just the early prologue. The first person Eddie meets is just referred to as the Blue Man. He is someone who was a part of the freak show that was a part of Ruby Pier when Eddie was a child. Of course, they don't really do that anymore because, you know, it's insensitive and bad. This particular person has blue skin because of an supposed cure to anxiety that he took in his young adulthood, which gradually turned his skin blue. So Eddie didn't know him, but he knew of him. He knew who he was because Eddie lived at Ruby Pier, and he knew basically everybody who worked there. And the thing that Eddie learns, and that we learn through him, is the fact that our actions actions, no matter how innocent they might seem, can have lasting impacts. And there was a phrase that was never actually uttered in the book, I don't believe. I don't believe it was ever actually said, but it was a phrase that kept coming to mind as I was rereading this, and it's a phrase that you've probably heard before: everything happens for a reason. Now, typically when you hear that phrase, it's said in sort of a trite, meaningless sort of way. But as far as this story is concerned, it doesn't have the same meaning. It doesn't have the meaning of, well, God had to kill off your child because of a grand master plan that he's come up with. No, that's not what it's saying. What it's saying is that everything happens for a reason, because everything happens because something else happened. There's no such thing as a random event. A thing happened because something caused it to happen, and that thing happened because something else caused it to happen, and so on and so on, and back and back and back. That's actually the next book. And that's not necessarily comforting per se, but it's not really meant to be. It's just sort of meant to be an acknowledgement of this is the way the world works. Everything is connected in some way, and when you do something, when you take some action, or even when you are in inaction, it's going to have an impact on other things. This is demonstrated through the way that the Blue Man ultimately died. He died because Eddie ran out in front of his car. He stopped, he braked, he kept himself from hitting him, but that so shook him up that he came so close to killing this child that he basically suffered a heart attack and died. And when Eddie learns about this, of course, he's very distraught. He's very upset that his, innocent action caused the death of this person, and he basically is just told that, like, that's the way it is sometimes. Like, we don't necessarily know that what impact the things that we do are going to have on others, but that's just the way the world works. Everything happens for a reason. Not necessarily a good reason, not necessarily a reason that makes any sense, but a reason nonetheless. And while the other lessons will be distinct from that one, they will all kind of echo that same feeling, that same idea of events and things that we do rippling across and causing other things to happen. Also, I do find it interesting that in this early scene, Eddie is, for the most part, not able to talk. He's not able to speak right away, and I like the line where it says it helps to listen. So when he's still, of course, learning, when he's still new to this, they don't want him to talk right away, they just want him to listen. So then Eddie moves on to the second person, and the second person is just referred to as Captain. Again, we never really know his name. We don't know the names of a lot of the people in this story because it's more fable-like, but he is the captain. He's Eddie's captain from when he was in World War II. So now we have somebody that Eddie actually knows well, and somebody who we can kind of understand how he would have had an impact on Eddie, but we actually don't understand the full extent of that impact until we get to that ending part of the story. So in the first section, there's not a lot of anecdotal stuff. Most of the sections contain a little bit of anecdotal stuff. They take us back to Eddie's life and tell us about, what the things went on. This one, the first one didn't have as much of that. It just had a few stories from Eddie's childhood, but the second section has a lot because it basically tells the entire story of Eddie's time in the war. In this section, we learn that Eddie was actually a POW. He was captured along with the rest of his group and held prisoner for some time. And this section actually gets a little grisly. It actually goes into a fair amount of detail as to the things that went on while he was a prisoner, and some of the things that Eddie and his people had to do to escape. And it demonstrates that Eddie is actually a very quick thinker, and he is actually, can be very cunning when he needs to be. Eddie actually comes up with the plan that helps them to ultimately escape the prison camp where they are. And he does it using his background in Ruby Pier, his background as someone who is something of a performer. And once again, we have this theme of actions having consequences, of everything being interconnected. Eddie and his group decide that after they've escaped and after they have killed their captors, they're just going to torch the entire camp. They're going to burn it all down. not because they really need to, but basically just because they're in a fit of passion. They've kind of got that triumphant, victorious feeling, and they're just like, let's just destroy it all. Let's just torch this entire place that was such a hell for however long we've been here. But that action has consequences, and it has consequences throughout the rest of Eddie's life. And we learn a little bit more of that in the last chapter, but basically Eddie is convinced at one point that there is a child in one of the houses that is burning. He's so convinced of this that he's actually prepared to run into the burning home to save the child, even though everyone is telling him there's no one there, there's no one there, you've got to get out of here, everything's gonna come burning down, you're gonna get yourself killed. And the only thing that kept him from running into that burning house is the fact that he was shot. He was shot in the knee, he was not able to walk, and he basically had to be sent home because his knee became so damaged from that gunshot wound. It's that gunshot wound that basically kept him from doing a lot of the things that he wanted to do with his life. It affected him for the rest of his life. And this is where we learned the impact that the captain had on him, because the captain is actually the one who shot him. And this is, of course, a big deal for Eddie, and this is something that Eddie has to come to terms with. He didn't know that at the time. He only learns that here in heaven, but it's something that he still has to come to terms with, because the captain, the impact that the captain had on his life was basically, as far as Eddie is concerned, to ruin his life. But the captain argues that by shooting him, he may have kept him from doing a lot of the things that he wanted to do, but he also saved his life, because he likely would have died had he run into that burning house. And the lesson here is one of sacrifice. Now, the way that it's played off is the fact that the captain saved Eddie's life and the life of his teammates. I don't know the actual term for it, that's why I keep saying these other words, but he saved all of their lives, but he himself was killed in doing so. And that's an important aspect of sacrifice as well, but I think there's actually kind of a deeper sacrifice to be had here. The idea that in order to live, Eddie had to sacrifice the full use of his leg. So he had to live with that pain in his leg and the ramifications that came with it for the rest of his life, but he did live. And they never really tell us which one was the right choice and which one Eddie would have picked, but they still drive that theme home that sacrifice is a part of life. We have to give up one thing in order to have some other thing. And often the choice is not ours to make. Someone makes it for us, but life is full of us sacrificing certain aspects of it. And again, sometimes that sacrifice helps somebody else, or sometimes that sacrifice affects somebody else, because everything is connected. And what the captain is really trying to impress upon him here is that even though his life was profoundly impacted by this, he still had things to live for. He still had things that needed to be done in his life. He still had a full life ahead of him, even if in Eddie's mind that life was largely meaningless. And there's also definitely a sense that the sacrifices don't necessarily have to be honorable. There's not necessarily anything inherently honorable in sacrifice. It's just a part of life. Now, one other interesting thing that I haven't talked about yet is that each of these characters that Eddie visits is living in their own personal heaven. I mentioned earlier that once you have met your 5 people, you get to go to your own personal heaven. You get to go to the place that you feel is your heaven, to wait to be one of the 5 people for somebody else. Now, for the blue man, his personal heaven was Ruby Pier, which alarmed Eddie at the beginning, because he thought that that was his personal heaven and he didn't want Ruby Pier as his personal heaven. He spent his entire life trying to escape it. But for the blue man, that was home. That was the place where he felt the most accepted, having that blue skin, because that was his job and that was the place where he felt the happiest in his life. But the captain's heaven is interesting, because the captain is basically, as far as Eddie can see, on this war-torn battlefield. He's in this place that has been completely torn apart by war. But that's Eddie's viewpoint. That's what Eddie is seeing. What the captain is seeing is something entirely different. The captain is seeing what this land looked like before it was torn apart by war. That is the place where the captain finds peace. Someone who spent his entire life fighting in wars and doing all of this stuff in the military, this is where he finds peace, is in a place where war maybe never existed, or at least never came to this particular place. So then Eddie moves on to the third person, and the third person is somebody that Eddie doesn't know at all. What's interesting about this third section is that it seems as though the third person that Eddie should be meeting is his father, because most of this section centers around Eddie and his relationship with his father, which was not a happy one. We basically see all of the different types of abuse that Eddie's father put against him. We see physical abuse, we see verbal and emotional abuse, and we see neglect. Eddie's father bullied Eddie his entire life. He basically made Eddie feel as though he needed to stay at Ruby Pier because his recurring mantra to him is, well, what, this isn't good enough for you? And of course, when Eddie got hurt in the war and was laid out for a while, Eddie's father really didn't understand that. He didn't understand post-traumatic stress disorder. Nobody did at that time. He didn't understand why Eddie couldn't just get up and go get a job. And eventually, Eddie's father stopped talking to him altogether, never spoke another word to him, and that was probably the most damaging thing that Eddie's father did to him. I like the metaphor that's used here of children being like panes of glass, and parents do damage to that glass all the time. Parents damage their children. It's part of life. It's just what they do in some way, whether they mean to or not. And so we see each point where Eddie's father broke the glass, each point where Eddie's father performed some action or acted in some way that damaged Eddie later in life. So why isn't Eddie's father the third person? There's a lot of reasons why this could be. I think one of the big ones is the fact that Eddie's father stopped talking to him, and even in the afterlife, Eddie's father isn't going to speak to him. That, I think, has something to do with it. But I think there's also kind of a bigger reason that they're going for here, which is the fact that Eddie's father acted in the way that he did not because he was just kind of inherently a bad person, but because of things that happened to him. Again, that theme of connectedness. His father treated him a certain way, and his father treated him a certain way, and onward back through the generations. And so the real thing that affected Eddie's father, and by extension Eddie, is Ruby Pier itself, and thus we have the older lady who Eddie meets, who he doesn't immediately recognize, but who is Ruby, who is the person that Ruby Pier is ultimately named after, and basically the reason why Ruby Pier exists in the first place. So it's not really so much Eddie's father that's having the impact here, but the place of Ruby Pier itself, which, as we've seen, Eddie has been trying to escape from his entire life, but it has maintained that hold on him. And part of that is due to his father, but part of that is due to other circumstances. Part of that is due to the fact that he got hurt in the war and he wasn't able to go off and do the things that he wanted to do. Part of that is the fact that when his father died, Eddie felt obligated to take over his job, to continue to do the work that his father had been doing to keep Ruby Pier safe. And Ruby herself is an interesting character because Ruby obviously regrets the fact that this park has caused so much misery to so many people, including her husband who built it. And I like the fact that she has kind of taken that in the afterlife and basically made her own personal heaven a place where all of these people can come who have been negatively affected by Ruby Pier in one way or another, including her husband and including Eddie's father. And the whole thing here is that Eddie needs to forgive his father for the way that he acted, not because Eddie's father didn't do anything wrong, he did many, many things wrong, but because Eddie just needs to let go of his anger, to keep from perpetuating that endless anger that has affected probably all the generations of his family. And so the lesson here is the importance of letting go of that anger, the importance of understanding that Eddie doesn't know his father's life. Eddie doesn't know everything there is to know about his father. He might not necessarily have to accept the things that he did, he might not necessarily have to condone the things that he did, but he has to acknowledge that he will never fully understand the reasons behind his father's actions, and for that reason, he needs to let go of that anger. The example they gave, of course, is the manner in which he died. Eddie grew up, went through his adulthood basically assuming that his father died because he went off in a drunken stupor and got sick and died from that. But as it turns out, that's not what happened. It's actually a much more complicated story than that. And again, we don't necessarily condone Eddie's father's actions, but in this particular case, he was actually acting out of a desire for goodness. He was acting out of something positive, to do something that needed to be done. And so it's not necessarily saying, oh, well, he was really a good person all along. It's just saying, I don't know what your motivations are. You're a complex person like everybody is. There is both good and evil in you, and it's not for me to cast judgment on what that might be, and so I'm just going to let go of this anger. And then we move on to the fourth person, who is Marguerite, who was Eddie's wife. Probably the person in this group of five that he knows the best. No, definitely the person he knows the best. I don't know why I said probably. And this chapter is probably the most straightforward of any of the sections, because it's his wife. We know what impact she had on him. That's not something that we really need to seek really deep understanding in. But there is a lesson to be learned here about love, and it's the fact that lost love is still love. Eddie lost Marguerite at a relatively young age, and he has been living without her for many, many years. And he has felt through that time that because he lost her, he does not have love in his life. But it's Marguerite who has to basically tell him, you do have love in your life, it's just that that love has been lost. It doesn't make it any less meaningful, it doesn't make it any less true, it makes it a little bit sadder, but it is still love regardless. You still hold love in your heart, and you still have love in your life. And this is definitely the saddest chapter, and it's even sadder for me now that I myself am married. But it's also the chapter, it also seems to be the person that Eddie spends the most time with. It's the one that he talks with the most. And of course, you know, this is basically his chance to catch up with his wife after all this time. It's his opportunity to really have a full conversation with him and get back into having a relationship with his wife that he hasn't gotten to have since she died. It's the one thing that he wants here. He wants more time, and he is actually granted it in this section of heaven. I also like Marguerite's version of heaven, which is basically just all these different weddings, all these different demonstrations of many, many different kinds of love. Not just the love between the bride and the groom, but the love that exists between the various family and friends who attend weddings, the love that is inherent in weddings, all kinds of love. And then finally, the fifth and final person and the fifth and final lesson, and this I think is reserved for the person who is the most impactful, because up to this point we've basically been moving in chronological order through Eddie's life as far as the people and the things that we're talking about in his life. But now we actually go back a little bit. Now we actually go back to the war. Because this is the point when we learn that yes, in fact, there was a person in that house that Eddie burned down. There was a child in there, and she died. But again, as we learn in this section, that action had an impact not just on other people, but on Eddie himself. Because Eddie felt so guilty about this thing that he believed himself to have done, that is largely probably what drove him to keep everything safe at Ruby Pier. It's what drove him to try to save Annie or Amy's life, even though it meant his own death. It's basically what drove his actions for the rest of his life. It's why he took over his father's job as head of maintenance at Ruby Pier. It's why he spent his entire life, even after his wife died, just trying to keep the ride safe at that park. And it's why he had such affection for the children there, and why he cared so much about keeping them safe. And this is another thing that Eddie has to let go of, because he has been holding on to this bitterness and this resentment for pretty much his entire life, and this is what he needs to let go of. And now we see the culmination of this idea of a meaningless life. Eddie has not lived a meaningless life. He has lived a life of sadness. He has lived a life that is seemingly ordinary, and he has lived a life where he didn't get to do a lot of the things that he wanted to do. He didn't get to have a child with Marguerite. He didn't get to travel. He didn't get to become an engineer like he wanted to. He never got to leave Ruby Pier. He did not accomplish really any of the things that he set out to accomplish in his life, but that doesn't mean that his life didn't have meaning. This is the final puzzle piece in Eddie's life. This is the final thing that really defined him as Eddie Maintenance, Eddie the Ride Man, the guy who keeps people safe at Ruby Pier. That was his impact. That was his legacy. And this is the thing that Eddie has to accept, the fact that even an ordinary life has meaning. An ordinary life will have an impact on other people and will profoundly profoundly affect the people around you in some way. This is the final message of the book, and this is probably the message that I would think a lot of people struggle with, and it's definitely the one that I struggle with the most. Because I'm at an age where I don't necessarily want to live an ordinary life. I think a lot of people in 20s and 30s, we still want to set out to accomplish great, impactful things. We still want to, go out there and travel and live lives filled with meaning as we understand meaning, but not necessarily meaning that is more difficult to understand, meaning in the little things that we do that impact people's lives each day. This is difficult to accept, and maybe it's one of those things that we really can't accept until after we've died and after we've had a chance to take a look at the tapestry of our lives and the other people that we've impacted with our lives and really see the meaning that our lives had. It's one of those things where in the moment maybe we can't see it other than in stories like this. But I think that reading stories like this can have some sort of effect, and reading stories like this can help us to see that if we can allow ourselves to see that and allow ourselves to see beyond just, it's other people, it's not me, I'm going to have a meaningful life, and allow ourselves to put ourselves in Eddie's shoes and to realize that we might not live an impactful or extraordinary life, that we might live a life of ordinariness and a life of mundanity and a life that doesn't seem to have any kind of effect on other people. But in fact, merely by living, and merely by just existing in the world, we are having an impact on people, and it's up to us to decide whether or not that impact will ultimately be a positive one or a negative one. It's a message that I still struggle to accept, and I think one that a lot of people struggle to accept, but it is an important message, and one that is not steeped in any one particular religion, is not steeped in any one particular faith-based anything. It's just a true part of life. It's what life is. It's regardless of whether you believe in anything supernatural, it is what life is. Life is connectedness. Life is having an impact on something. Life is cause and effect and things happening for some reason, even if it's a reason that we can't see or understand. And ultimately, that's why this book is an ultimate recommendation. That is why I think that this book should be read and digested and talked about and thought about by people from all walks of life. People who are religious, people who are non-religious, people who are anti-religious. It is a book that needs to be read and understood because it is so true to the life that we live. That's my take on the 5 people you meet in heaven. And until next time, friends, neighbors, and fellow VEDSies, I'll see you tomorrow.